Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that since our previous lectures we are discussing a lot on Premchand. We discussed on Premchand's life, we discussed on his novels, and today also we would be discussing on the short stories written by Premchand. And for this we have again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. He is a retired professor, as well as I would like to tell you all that he has contributed for almost more than 4 decades in the teaching profession, and I hope that we would be taking advantage from his experience and would be learning more about Premchand. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Anand Prakash. Sir, welcome to the EDUCET lecture. And because these lectures are very interesting, and through these lectures we are able to understand more about Premchand, I hope that today also we would be getting more insight into the Premchand's writing through his short stories. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vitika, for your kind words, and welcome viewers to this discussion, which is the third in the series on Premchand. And today we will be discussing Premchand's short stories. Now, most of us who read for pleasure and entertainment, or we have done some reading of Hindi literature in our courses, in our syllabi, in schools and colleges, would be familiar with Premchand as a short story writer. Of course, as a novelist, but because novels are long and they are prescribed for only specialist courses, short stories can be given in any textbook, and that's how Premchand may be known to most of the people as a writer of short stories. Premchand ki kahaniyan, Premchand ka kahanikar ke roop mein, etc., etc. Premchand in his life was a campaigner, as I suggested in my previous discussions. And if he was a campaigner, then he campaigned for the national movement in India that was going against the British imperialist interests, and in which millions of Indians were involved. Premchand, as a writer, took it upon himself to organize opinion, to mobilize opinion, to collect people on the platform of understanding and struggling with imperialism. And he gave this task to himself. And if he had to be directly communicating to his audience in India, either directly in English or in Hindi or Urdu, or through translations, because Premchand had been, people had started translating him into other languages quite early. So he would be, in a way, sending across a message through his short fiction, through his short stories. And each short story, would address some topical problem, some topical question. And while doing so, Premchand would also bring in some of the larger issues of society, of politics, of ideology, of even world literature, depending on the situation at the time when Premchand would write his specific short story. Premchand began his career as a short story writer, and soon he became a novelist, but his short story writing remained as regular as before. Premchand was editing, in his literary career, a number of magazines, particularly two. The first was called Madhuri, and the second was called Hans. And he was involved with other magazines too, for which he wrote regularly. And Madhuri and Hans were monthly magazines, and Premchand would always give one of his short stories for each magazine, whichever he was publishing at the time. So which means that if there were 12 issues of the magazine, then there would be 12 short stories written by him in that year. And since he, as a storyteller, he became very famous, he was quite popular. Readers, in fact, waited for his short stories to appear in the magazines. Therefore, he had a lot of pressure of writing short stories, and Premchand's habit was to just take down, to take a piece of paper and pen, and then he would start just write down. he would not have time, he was so busy, he would not have time to have a second look at his short stories. So it might happen sometimes, that sentences would be corrected, not by Premchand himself, but by the person who was editing, who was proofreading, etc., etc. And since Premchand was bilingual, he wrote in Urdu or in Hindi, and his language flowed in each version, from the point of view of vocabulary and words. And sometimes the certain difficult words, either in Persian or in Sanskritized Hindi. Of course, he didn't know Sanskritized Hindi, but then somebody would always help him. And then particularly the Persian words would be replaced by the Hindi or the Sanskrit word, and that may have created problems. But well, since Premchand was a writer quite accessible to the audience and to the readers, therefore he would be able to communicate, howsoever difficult the word would be. Sometimes, the word is difficult, but the context is so direct and so immediate, so urgent that, in that urgency of the moment, the reader understands, at least vaguely, what is being suggested through a difficult word. And this way, Premchand carried on. So, guess, viewers, how many stories Premchand would have written in his short life. I call it comparatively short life. He died at the age of 56. And in 56 years, the active literary years would be at the most 25 or 28. And in 25 years of life, when he wrote a large number of novels, he wrote 11 or 12, and some of the novels were very long. How many short stories would he have written? Guess. Well, the answer to this question is that Premchand wrote around 250 short stories, which means it would come to, about in 25 years, if you write 250 short stories, then 10 stories, 10 short stories a year. And that along with other things, he would edit magazines, he would write editorials, he would translate from other literatures. He would write even critical articles on not merely short story and novel, but also on poetry. I particularly remember, an article by him on a senior Urdu poet of the time, and the person's name was Akbar Allahabadi, who was in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And Premchand gave a wonderful analysis of Akbar Allahabadi's, poetry in one of the, longish articles that he wrote. So in this busy schedule, if Premchand is able to write 250 or so short stories, then it's a big achievement for a writer. And more so because the writer is in demand. People wait for his short stories to come, as I said, and when they wait, then they lap up as soon as the story appears, and it becomes a matter of discussion in the middle class homes, in the lower middle class homes in particular, because those people needed information and ideas, and Premchand would provide to the audience, to the readers, very important information and ideas that was needed at that time. I also said in one of the earlier discussions that Premchand was communicating in such a manner that he would be useful for a reader. He would not merely entertain the reader, entertain he would, of course. He was a great entertainer. He was a very popular writer. He would be able to hold suspense whenever he continued with the story. Whenever he went on, people would wait with bated breath as to what will come next in his short stories. But the main purpose of Premchand was to mix this entertainment with some kind of education, some kind of message. And Premchand without message is unthinkable. You have to think of Premchand, and a message will straight away come to you. And that message will be so very important, so very worth adopting, that you will make it a part of your life. You will start molding your understanding according to the requirements of the message. And therefore, Premchand became a great teacher in culture, a great teacher in Indian society, Indian politics, in the realm of ideology about the Indian ethos and all those things. So these stories, were that way a part of this process that I have already described to you. Now, what was the state of the short story as a genre at the time Premchand started using this particular literary form? This is a question that I ask myself, and I also want you to consider as to what kind of story was there as a tradition at the time when Premchand started writing. And the answer is that there was nothing worth there was nothing worth mentioning in the story that was available as a form at that time. In the 19th century, people would not write short stories. When Premchand would write at the turn of the century, then very many people would not consider a story to be a subject of a matter of writing and getting printed. And whatever stories existed in the early years of the 20th century would be stories which would be most of them folk tales. So somebody they've been doing the rounds, and people sometimes put them down in word in black and white, and then they might be available in some books. And the second thing would be that these short stories would be only about gods and goddesses, or about princes and princesses, and very few people would think of reading a short story for the purpose of getting closer to their lives. So Premchand had this challenge of evolving a short story form that was entirely suitable to the Indian conditions, to the Indian cultural context. And what he did was that he might have got some idea of the short story from his reading of Western literature. There were writers available in English or in English translation. Russian literature was available in English translation the world over. Americans had come forward to write good short stories. English literature had certain short stories, and this form, French literature had some short story writers, and they were quite popular in India among the educated masses. So Premchand would have become acquainted with this kind of a short story that came from the Western countries. But he also was aware that when one writes a short story, one has to communicate to the reader of one's place, and he could not straight away lift a form from somewhere else and plant it here. So what he would do was to mix the available conventions of short storytelling, short story writing in India, and then expand their scope and make them more meaningful for the audience than was the case with maybe some other contemporary writers. And there are a few things that Premchand did while doing it, but then the end result was that short story came to be associated as something distinct and independent in the case of Premchand. Premchand gave this particular short story form a distinct form. There is a stamp that the short story carries of Premchand as a writer. And Premchand is not a static writer. He doesn't write the same kind of short story on and on. He keeps on growing, developing, evolving, adjusting himself, experimenting, creating new kinds of variations and all those things. And that way, when things come to an end in 1936, when Premchand breathes his last, then you can understand that short story form in his hands has a variety that is difficult to miss, and people feel inspired to carry on this tradition by experimenting with the short story later on. So he gives the short story a distinct form. It's a form that is not available earlier. In fact, distinctness also lies in the fact that after Premchand, the Premchand kind of a short story disappeared. There are other forms, there were other variations of the short story that appeared, and Premchand was left behind. But who knows? Premchand has a great sense of recovering himself. So maybe he becomes once again relevant. In fact, people in the 1970s and 80s started talking of going back to Premchand for the kind of short story that the Indian reader required. So it's that kind of situation and an issue, and readers would be quite curious to know as to what Premchand did with the short story, how he used it, how through it he communicated his content to the reader. So let me tell you a few things that Premchand did in the course of writing short stories. First, he always think of certain specific characters who would draw your attention as a reader. So you read a short story, and Premchand takes you takes me to a particular character, this character has a personality of one's own. If it's a woman or a man, and first thing that Premchand ensures is that the characters that he picks up are real characters. You can identify them easily in life. Real, not in the sense that he he also takes the situation and the character from his neighborhood. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that these characters appear plausible. These characters appear acceptable as people who walk around in the streets of India and in the villages and urban centers. So and these are ordinary people. So no kings and princesses, no kings and princes for him, except rarely. They also appear when he goes into the mode of the folk tale. But otherwise, Premchand just picks up a peasant, Premchand picks up a pandit, Premchand picks up a Harijan, Premchand picks up a woman, gives her any name, but you can straight away see that these are the people he's talking about. And he has that what critics call typicality in his choice. So a typical teacher, a typical student, a typical young man, a typical young woman, a typical peasant, a typical patwari, all these things, a typical daroga. So those Premchand those whom Premchand saw around him in his own time, those people will be taken from there, and then Premchand would put them in his short stories. And when he does them as a character, then he gives them a voice and an opinion. So Premchand is not bothered about telling the outer appearance of the character. Sometimes he refers to it, but only vaguely. But what he says, what he makes these people say, that is important. And he gives them a personality. So they have a point of view. So even if it's an illiterate person, even if it's an illiterate woman, even if it's a child, that child also will be used as projecting a point of view. That point of view may not be of the child directly or completely, but then maybe the child is mimicking somebody else whom he or she has seen. So that way Premchand makes his characters very interesting, and most of his writing, most of his fictional writing, most of his short stories, they are connected with certain characters who speak, who hold dialogues with others and who assert themselves. So that's the kind of thing that Premchand does in his writing, that he picks up characters and then he gives them a voice, he gives them dialogues. They differ with you, they ask questions from you, they also answer the questions that you raise. Then Premchand, by making these people come alive on the page, the printed page, Premchand also puts them into very ordinary, simple, popular situations, those situations which are common. So you can't think of Premchand and start seeing that Premchand is talking about a village one has not seen, or Premchand is talking about a shopkeeper whom one has not seen. So the situation of the shopkeeper while selling, that's a situation that a shopkeeper is selling to a customer. And this situation we are all familiar with. When we go to meet a shopkeeper, then we know that the shopkeeper talks in a particular manner, and he always looks very quizzically and also alertly at the customer, then accordingly shapes one's opinion and attitude. So the situation of the shopkeeper is a common situation, and Premchand would present a shopkeeper as a shopkeeper, as in a typical situation. So the famous critical phrase is a typical character in a typical situation, and Premchand instinctively follows this. The third thing that he does is that his short stories begin, not formally, but they have a beginning. You can think of something that may have happened before. There will be references to that, but at a particular point, the short story begins, and then a problem is posed. And then the problem involves, a number of people. There is a person at the center. There are others with that person. And then, this problem that is posed, towards the end, it reaches what is called a solution. Sometimes a question also, not a resolution, but mostly Premchand's short stories end with a resolution. So when you read a short story by Premchand, you should know, that the person will present a problem, and then he will offer a direct or an indirect solution. And in that solution, maybe there is a kind of happiness because you are expecting that solution to happen and that solution actually happened. Or you had some doubt about the picture that Premchand presented, therefore that doubt will be further strengthened at the end of the story. So the stories have a very clear beginning and a very clear ending. So when you have read a story, then you have gone through a certain experience, you have gone through a certain process of unraveling the question and all those things, and this is what happens. Then Premchand makes his stories multidimensional. So they are not focused entirely on one character. Not that the one person is the hero, as the case with the popular Hindi film, that there is a hero and you always are stuck with the hero in your attention. Premchand doesn't do that. Premchand describes the situation. Premchand, as a writer, as a narrator, comments on a problem. Premchand generalizes, then brings the hero or other characters and they talk. And when they talk, they stick to their own opinion. So because he also gives proper, appropriate dialogues to other characters than the protagonist, than the main character, therefore, very soon you realize that maybe the protagonist is not correct and somebody else is talking correctly. So in a way, there is a multiplicity of discourses. There is a variety of opinions. So there are 4 people who are discussing and all the 4 are saying 4 different things. Therefore, there are 4 opinions and these opinions clash. And when these opinions clash, then of course the reader can always try to work out in one's own mind the correctness or the lack of correctness of a particular situation, and one can start thinking even beyond the short story. So you read a story, you come to the end, maybe you are not satisfied, then you go to your friend and talk to him or her, and you tell this person that this is what you read, but you don't like it, and the discussion begins outside the short story. In the real life situation, the readers start discussing the short story. So see the multiplicity of dimensions in Premchand, where things don't stop at one place or remain fixed at one place, but they keep moving and they keep changing their character by the moment. Then I already told this, but I'll explain it now a little more now, that Premchand always has a purpose in his mind. He wants to say to tell the reader that this is what is correct and this is what is wrong, and the correct part is emphasized by him. So when one has read a story, then one has learned a lesson, and that lesson has become a part of the understanding of the reader. This is quite clear. Premchand would give a message always. Premchand would like his reader to be a good person. So he will raise a question in such a manner that a person who collects money and a person who wants to stick to goodness, these 2 people clash in the story, but the person who will win potentially or actually will be the person who is good, not one who collects the money. So there are 2 opinions about money, that money spoils people. There is another that money gives them success and gives them pleasure. So these 2 opinions clash in a short story by Premchand, and the answer, so far as Premchand is concerned, is that one should be honest, one should be an ideal person, one should be good. And therefore the person who has the money and who has the success is shown as more or less selfish, self-centered and insensitive, cynical, all those things. So Premchand has a message to give. He is expecting his readers to always learn some lesson from the short story, as the preacher would always expect the listener to take a good message back home and become a good person. So Premchand that way, to that extent, is a preacher. Of course, his preaching is different from the preaching of a person who talks from the pulpit, because there is always the example, that there is always the emphasis on you should do. So there are lots of do's in a preaching. In Premchand's stories, there are no do's. So he doesn't count, well, this is good, that is good, third thing is good, fourth is this, etc. He doesn't talk like a teacher, but then he shows the good person as a happy person, as a relaxed person, as a person who inspires confidence of the reader, as one who should be emulated by the reader. He shows them as a good person, and this visual part, in his short stories always has its impact on the reader. So this message that he conveys sometimes can get political. In many stories, Premchand would talk about, there are stories where Premchand is presenting the point of view of the market, and in the market, people are avoiding selling certain things and selling others, projecting certain other things. There are people who are demonstrating against foreign goods, for instance. Premchand gives that picture also. So that way, his poetry, his short stories, and the message ingrained therein, that message becomes political in nature. So if the foreign goods are being are discarded, are thrown out, are being rejected by the customer in the short story, then it's a political message. Then Premchand is directly telling people to go for Swadeshi, to go for what is produced in one's own country. So that way, Premchand can take up such a situation. The third situation would be whether tradition should obstruct the working of a person, or should it be allowed to obstruct the working of a person, or should it be questioned and discarded. Now, whether religion is good or bad, whether tradition is good or bad, whether convention is good or bad, this thing is gone into by Premchand quite effectively in his short stories, and the message is always that the reader should adopt the ways of modernity, rationality, tolerance, humanism. So these are the messages that Premchand is continuously giving, and interestingly, these are the messages of the national movement also. So when the national movement is going on, then people are supposed to be friends of one another, should be bonded in some kind of a unity against a common enemy, and therefore Premchand is making a ground for the unity of the country, unity of the nation. That is taken up as a positive development in society, and therefore this unity is emphasized again and again in Premchand's short stories. So he always has these messages. Premchand can sometimes couch these messages in the language of convention and tradition. So there he will use a folk tale. He can have a folk tale, where there are two friends, fight with each other, and at the end, they unite. It's a folk tale. There is a son who has left his father's home, has gone away, but finally he comes back and he reconciles with the parents and the family. So this is a folk tale kind of a message. And Premchand is always for some kind of a harmony, some kind of a tranquility. But sometimes Premchand can, I'll give these examples later also, sometimes Premchand can shock you out of your complacency. For instance, there is a short story, I'll refer to him to it again. In this short story, there is a young girl who commits suicide, and her mother very, very strangely celebrates her suicide. And when somebody asks, why are you doing it? Because your daughter committed suicide. She said she did it for a cause. She didn't want to live a life of insult, and therefore she was angry, and in anger she took her life. She went and jumped into the river, and she was drowned. So I'm quite glad that she did it, because if she had not taken that stand, then she would have suffered all her life. So imagine the kind of message that Premchand's short stories can give. This short story that I am particularly referring to is the short story titled Shanti. And in this story, there is a young woman. Young woman means a middle-aged woman. At that time, she is 35 or so. She becomes a widow, but she has a daughter, and she has to look after her. And the daughter finally is married, and the woman is quite happy till the marriage happens. But after that, the woman, the daughter realizes that she is not, her husband is not very sympathetic towards her, understanding towards her, and he is not loyal to her. And he has his affairs elsewhere, and his habits are bad. And the daughter takes it as a kind of insult to her. And therefore, one day, she commits suicide. And that's where, this young widow, and in a way is proud of. And she is comparing her daughter with a brave soldier who went to fight in the battle and, courted death. So that kind of a message, and then the story ends like this. There was a kind of Shanti on the face of the young daughter who died, and there was a kind of Shanti also on the mother's face. So this is the kind of Shanti that Premchand is projecting. What kind of message is this? Should this message be acceptable? Well, some people will accept the message, but it will require intellectual courage, moral courage to accept such a message that life of insult is worse than, you can say that if you have to choose between the death of a person and life of honor, the life of insult, then you should choose the life that is taken away through death. So that kind of a message is a very intellectual message, and people will start thinking about it. Most of the people would disagree. Even today, people will disagree that no, suicide is wrong and bad. But then Premchand as a writer is raising a question. He is not, of course, promoting the cause of suicide. What he is saying is that there is a point in living honorably and not living with, surrounded by all kinds of insults. So that's the message that Premchand gives, and the kind of debate is aroused by this, is created by this, generated by this, and through that debate, some kind of a light is seen at the end of the tunnel. So this is the kind of story. So he has messages to give always. Without a message, Premchand's story generally is not complete. I say generally because there might be some exceptions, but at the moment I am talking of not exceptions, but the general thing that Premchand is doing through his writings. Then the last thing that I would say about Premchand's stories in general, I'll take up then specific examples, is that he always, experimented in his short stories. His eye would be always on the reader's expectations and reader's requirements. So this is what the reader wants. But Premchand has to comment whether the desires of the reader are wrong or right. So he has to make some kind of judgment and assessment. On the other side, he has to tell the reader that something else is perhaps more important than his desires, and for that the ground is created for him. So he keeps on experimenting regularly with his form as a writer of short stories. Sometimes it's a folk tale, in that he brings in modernity. Sometimes it's a modern kind of a story in which he seeks the element of something else, of not just the present circumstance, but some example somewhere. Sometimes he can mix characters. A person who is a poor person can be a hero, and sometimes a hero is shown as an ordinary person. He can show all these things, and he is creating situations in which the characters do not remain fixed to a particular stance, but the characters themselves learn and bring about a change in their perception and in their outlook. So these things carry on in Premchand's short stories, and that's how Premchand remains interesting even today. And if you read his stories, I'm sure you would not leave them without getting to the end of them, and then you'll read and ask for more. Now, the last point I have already touched, but then I want to extend it further. In India, in Hindi, there is a word called drishtant. Drishtant is some kind of a udaharan, some kind of a example. So most of us, particularly storytellers of the village, people who move around and tell what is called kathavachak, tell kathas, they generally use drishtant in their speech when they talk out before or after the katha. And this drishtant is okay. You make a statement and then you say, now see the example, and then they give the example. That example is sometimes very interesting. And what Premchand is doing is that he is using most of his short stories as drishtant, as some kind of an example. So he says, telling a lie is wrong, and now here, how it is wrong. And then he gives a drishtant, an udaharan, some kind of a anecdotal example. So most of Premchand's short stories are in the format of, in the mode of a drishtant. And that's why people always have them as some kind of lessons in ideology and culture. So this is about the short stories, and so if you have 250 short stories of Premchand, then you have 250 drishtants, examples picked up from life and recreated in such a manner that a lot of invention can be seen there, and Premchand is regaling you, is making you enjoy them, the things, but he doesn't deviate from the logic of the drishtant or the example. Now, viewers, I'll take up a few short stories as some kind of a drishtant here of this idea that I have already, introduced you to, and it is here, that some of the points that I make might become a little more clear. Now, there is a story by Premchand. It's a story which is of the mature phase, I believe, but it appears very simple. This is the story of a grass cutting woman. A woman, who goes out into the fields, and there she cuts the grass, then makes a bundle of it, brings this bundle to the market and sells it. And after she has got the money, then she'll come back home, and then she'll cook her food. And her husband, who is also a poor laborer, then both of them will sit together and eat. So this is the kind of situation in which the writer has put this woman, and she is called Ghaswali. So she is the one who is cutting the grass, and she is selling the grass. Now, viewers, imagine what would be the economic status of such a woman. I think she would be the lowest of the low. So she doesn't have any field to work on. She doesn't have a proper house. Her husband is a laborer himself. They live on a daily basis. They get their money in the evening. Then they buy something and then they eat. So it's the poorest of the poor that Premchand has picked up, and even among the poor, he has picked up a woman. Now, what is the problem that Premchand presents in this story, Ghaswali? The problem is that she is good looking, not exactly in the formal in the popular sense of the word. Not that she has a fair skin and she looks like a flower and all those things, but Premchand says that she has a personality and she has a kind of look because of which people when they pass by, then they stop and have a look at her. And she is vulnerable economically. She is a very weak person, so anybody can make advances to her. And who knows, in the 1920s, these women had no choice but to satisfy the lust of the passers-by. And Ghaswali would otherwise also would be cutting grass from somebody else's fields. So the landlord is always there to exploit her sexually. So this is the situation in which the Ghaswali is placed by Premchand. And this young, lecherous landlord, he passes by and he looks at her and he passes some comment. And finally, she makes it clear to him that she is not interested in him at all, because he is only lusting for her, and she is married and she has her own honor to protect, etc. And then she argues with him. Now, how is it that Premchand is making this character argue with a landlord who is interested only in her body? Now, this is where the woman sticks, and Premchand has given this voice and a kind of opinion to the person, and she talks and she argues. And she tells him very clearly she is not interested in this kind of a sexual alliance with the person. Maybe there are other women who are, but she is not. And then this person doesn't want to take a no from her, but he doesn't know what to do. He can't argue with her properly, and therefore he starts thinking about it. And then I think on one occasion she tells him that what is important in a man and a woman, between a man and a woman, is love, is not lust. And in any case, she doesn't love him. She is quite loyal to her husband, and she'll remain loyal to him all her life. And then this person starts changing his behavior. He learns this lesson from the woman, illiterate, young, vulnerable, economically weak woman. He starts considering her idea, and then he realizes that he has been doing all the wrong things in his life. So see the message. The message is that if you argue with people clearly, respectfully, correctly, firmly, then people will think and change themselves. And this change occurs in this landlord, this young landlord, and he starts believing then, that it's not the way to approach a woman this way, and he should respect her. And after some time, when he starts showing respect to her, then she also, melts a bit, and she says, okay, now, if you like me, you love me, I also can love you, but I have I have a husband at home. And I can't cross any boundaries, etc. Love we can have ourselves. It doesn't matter. The love is there in my mind. It can be there in your mind also. I like you. You may also like me. But that is all about it. Now, why should Premchand write this story this way? In the 1920s and 30s, the question that I again ask. And my answer is that he is giving a voice to a woman. And is giving not just a voice, but modern ideas to her. And she should, firmly establish her identity in the story. and she then becomes a powerful woman, and through argument she can win the heart of this person. So this person will not force himself on her, he will go his own way, and she will be loyal to her husband. And if there is some scope of love in one's mind, then well, all human beings have this right to love in a situation where they are placed. So it's a very open kind of a story, and no traditionalist, no conventional person would ever like such a story. And that's what Premchand's purpose was. He wanted to attack convention, he wanted to attack tradition, and he wanted to create an atmosphere in which people would decide their own fate. And in this case, the woman is deciding her own fate. Now, if you go deeper into the story, you will realize that this woman did not involve her husband. She could have done that, like the situation, the woman in a film. The moment the woman is insulted or approached by another person, then she rushes to her lover or to her husband, and the husband comes and beats up the other person. This is not the case with Premchand. The woman directly talks to him, tries to change his opinion, and after that she tells him very clearly, sorry, I can't go beyond this. If you like me and if I like you, then we are friends, and you can move around. That's very fine. But as far as having an alliance is concerned, that is socially not acceptable, is impossible for her to adopt. So this is the kind of situation. So I really like the story for its fine balance between righteousness, morality, and the principle of deciding and choosing on one's own. So the woman is given a chance to choose one's own path, and that path she does firmly and convincingly. So this is Ghaswali for us, and you realize that this kind of woman is difficult to get even in the upper classes today. Even in the upper classes, you won't have this kind of self-respect that this young woman in a village shows, and the kind of loyalty that she has for the husband and for the healthy conventions of life. And the story even today will be, quite successful in communicating a moral message, a message of idealism, a message where human dignity is asserted and not any kind of compromise. Then there is a second story. This is called Algoja, or the division in the property of a family. And in this story, the brother who is married dies, and he leaves a widow behind. And he has a younger brother who is quite junior. I think the gap between the elder brother and the younger brother is 10 years or so. And the woman's property would go somewhere. And it can't come to legally it can't come to the woman. And there is a problem regarding the property. And the younger brother is supposed to marry someone, but then he doesn't want to marry that person. So anyway, the younger brother doesn't marry, the widow cannot own the property, where would the property go? And so there is a kind of a question. And then the situation is handled by the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law observes the scene. She looks at the young woman who is a widow now. She looks at the brother-in-law who is 5-6 years junior to her, and this person doesn't marry. And why is not married? Why is he not marrying? This woman asks herself, the mother-in-law, and finally she thinks that the boy is enamored of his bhabhi in the home. So generally, the mother-in-law would not like such an idea, such a kind of possibility that the widowed daughter-in-law would ever have an alliance with in marriage with the brother-in-law, the devar. And but the woman takes the initiative. She first talks to the woman. I'm not sure. She talks perhaps. She makes sure that the brother will perhaps marry her if there is a chance. Then she talks to the woman, and she asks the woman, "You decide that the situation is this: that you are a widow, and the property may go outside if this boy marries, but he is not marrying. Why is he not marrying? I know." She tells him. She tells her. She says he is not marrying because he has. She does it very straight away. She says he has an eye on you. He likes you, and it's a kind of a marriage. The widowed sister-in-law Bhabhi will marry a young devar, and with the consent of the mother-in-law. And in this consent, the important decision will be taken by the widowed daughter-in-law herself. So this kind of a story, I don't think even today this kind of modernity is easily acceptable in the Indian conditions. But then there is once again an illiterate middle-aged woman, the Saas, and she not only allows this kind of marriage to happen, but she is preparing ground for this kind of a marriage. And this is called, this story is titled Algoja by Premchand, and he gives this answer. You may disagree with it. I think most of us would like to disagree with it. But then Premchand is posing a question: why not? If the widowed woman and the young man, and who is in age also junior to her, if the two decide to marry, what's wrong in this? They decide themselves, and then the woman has particularly decided that the boy is acceptable. So this kind of a marriage even today would be called some kind of incest. So Bhabhi means a sister-in-law, and Premchand doesn't find anything wrong in this. And these stories became, a talk of the town in those days. It is these stories which would be eye-openers in the cultural scene in India at that time, so that people looked at things from a different critical angle, and created a new set of morals rather than sticking to the old morals. And in any case, the story thematically is reformist, because a widow should not always live a life of a widow. She can marry and go away. This kind of a marriage is allowed now. It was allowed in those days also. But Premchand is making an interpretation of it and saying, well, if it is so, then it can happen anywhere else. The third story that I picked up for today's discussion, that I have already presented as a case, Shanti, tranquility, and I particularly talk about two more stories. I still have about 10 minutes to go for the discussion. There is a very famous story that Premchand wrote in the last years of his life in the 1930s, and this story is called Pushkirat. Now, Push is the month of winter. I think it's January, let's say, Posh, whatever. And there is a peasant, and he has to spend time in the field at night, and he doesn't have anything to cover himself with, and he's in a tent, and he has to burn a fire outside. He sits next to the fire. Then the fire also is extinguished. It can't go on forever. It was able to warm him for half an hour or an hour or so. Then where should the peasant go at night? Now in what is called the Pushkirat, in the wintry night. And then he goes to the tent, and there he has a cot, and he doesn't have much cover on the cot. He doesn't have a quilt also. So what he does is that he somehow twists himself, he shuffles, he moves around, and he cannot keep himself warm. Therefore, he has a dog outside. So he picks up the dog and he embraces the dog, and the dog gives him warmth, and the peasant gives warmth to the dog, and the two cling to each other, and this is how the wintry night is spent. Now, friends, can you visualize this kind of a peasant in India in the 1930s? That who didn't have anything to cover himself with on a wintry night, and he spent the night outside in the fields, and Premchand wrote this story. It's such a stark story of poverty, of lack of means, etc., that it's hair raising. It's a harrowing kind of a tale that Premchand is telling. And mark you, in this story, Premchand is not offering a solution. Generally, he offered a solution. He would always, say, okay, there is a problem, and now this is the solution, and you adopt it. In this story, he is not giving a solution either. So in the morning, the dog, jumps away from him and goes to a corner, and the peasant is coming back home. But then the way he spent the night, and the kind of the bitter cold that he went through, that of course will not keep things and stable in one's mind. And it's a story that is often quoted today, and most of the critics talk about this story, and Premchand is making a comment on the political and the social situation in the country, where a large number of people who are peasants, they are denied the means of subsistence. And the story straightaway connect with today's India. In today's India, there are thousands of people who are committing suicide among peasantry in different parts of the country. And this person is, I think, in the same situation. So if from 1930 onwards, and national movement started, let's say, in the 1890s, and it went up to 1930s when Premchand was alive, and this was the plight of a peasant. Where would such a peasant go? And if you have a second critical look at the society, then even in the 2015 or so, peasantry is facing the same situation. So this kind of a poverty, writers have to think of, writers have to present, share with the audience with respect to information, and then think about this question in such a manner that the social system changes and make the life of these people comfortable and worth living, and they should have proper place to live in, and they should have children, and they should be able to educate them, etc. All that is important, but who is bothering about it? In fact, I was reading an article the other day in a newspaper where people were talking about development, and then this person raised the question that the country should develop, but the country cannot develop if the human capital is not taken care of. And I was wondering as to what human capital is. I had never heard this word. Geetika, what do you say?
Yes, so we often describe human capital with the money and something like that, but the human capital in the true sense is the human being, the society where the human beings live.
Yes, yes. And if this is what the human capital is reduced to, then what kind of change are we talking about? So this person, he said that human capital is important. Human capital means that so much of nourishment will be given to people. Such kinds of hygienic conditions will be provided to them. That is human capital. So nobody is talking about human capital and human development. We are talking about development. As a development by itself will solve all the problems. So Premchand in the 1930s is talking about such a situation where the peasant, the majority of the Indian population at that time, the peasant is compelled to live a life of deprivation of this level. And the last story that I'll take up, I still have 5 minutes to go. That story is the famous Eidgah, which I think most of us have read at some stage in the school. And I read it, under a slightly different framework, and I realized that this story is one of the most violent stories that Premchand has written. In the sense, that the child who is just 5 or 6 years, or at the most 10 years, and this child is talking in terms of killing people. The child is talking in terms of joining the army. The child is talking in terms of facing the police. It's a young child who is just playing games, and he says he's talking about chimta that he has bought for his aunt, for his grand aunt, and he says this chimta is like a gun, and I'll take this gun here and I'll kill all the enemies, etc. What is Premchand telling through this story? And then I further went into the details of the story, and I realized that the woman was herself a widow, and she, in fact, in the story, when she looked at this small child who is her grandson, buying a chimta for her, then she went back into her own life and thought this child was not the child but was her husband. And so you see in the story, in the fantasy of the woman, the old woman thinks that this boy is an old man and he has brought a chimta for her and he is her protector. So this kind of a story where the child thinks of fighting, the child thinks of killing people only because such deprivation exists. So Premchand is somehow experimenting into the short story mode in such a manner that things are turned upside down in the story, and we cannot call it merely as about child psychology. It's not child psychology, it's more than that. Through the child psychology, the distinctions and differences at different levels in society, they are being reproduced for us so that we consider these issues seriously. So imagine a family in which there is a child and there is an old woman. Suppose the old woman falls sick at night. What will happen? Where will the child go? Suppose the child meets with an accident. Where will the woman take him? So it's a completely vulnerable section of society, and Premchand is picking up this thing as a subject of his short story, and he is doing it in the last years of his life. And when there seem to be no answers either in Gandhian philosophy, in Gandhian politics, or in anything else that is available at the time. And then Premchand picks up these two stories, particularly Pushkirat and Eidgah. And in these stories, violence, the kind of violence is presented in the starkest possible terms. And when the readers read, then they'll be disturbed no end. and when there is no solution, etc. And if the writer is not able to make any solution, how can ordinary masses think of any solution in that situation? So Premchand in his short stories is holding a kind of mirror up to society, where they see their own conflicts, their own problems, their own handicaps, etc., and where in many cases they do not find a viable solution. There might be some kind of a solution distantly visible, but that solution is not there in the society of the time. So Premchand in his own time presented issues in such a manner that people were compelled to think, and if they thought, then of course through the thinking they can find some answer, if not at that time, maybe later. So this is how Premchand becomes a significant writer in India in the 20th century, a writer, one of the finest writers of the national movement, who wants to take society forward and cannot do so because of the hard circumstances that is surrounded by. So this is where I finish, and viewers, I hope these questions are still alive, and one can consider them maybe much more squarely today, because there are more things available to us in terms of understanding, and we have certain critical tools which we didn't have at that point of time, and writers then will carry on their job with that kind of commitment. One can expect this.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us detailed information about Premchand. In fact, I should not use information, because it is not merely an information, it is the history which Premchand created, and today we love to read Premchand more and more. And I would like to tell you all that if you have any queries, we can definitely take your queries in later lectures when Professor Anand Prakash comes. And I would like to tell you all again that our ID is info.cec@nic.in, where you can send us your queries, and we would love to solve your queries. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.